Well, thank you, and good morning. I've got quite a loud voice, I know, but I'm assuming that you can hear me at the back. Very good. So I wanted to start with a story about coffee, because I've seen the irresistible allure of coffee this morning. The Medical Research Council funded Cognitive and Brain Sciences unit at Cambridge University has a very simple rule. It's about 75, 80 research scientists. And the very simple rule is this: if you are in the office and if you are not doing an experiment, you absolutely have, on a 3-line whip, to go to morning coffee and afternoon tea. The hours 10:45 to 11:15 and 3:15 to 3:45 are sacrosanct. The head of the MRC unit is very cross if people are in the building but working on that paper. And it's not just because they love biscuits and cake. I mean, they do love biscuits and cake. This has been a rule for many years. And the quality of home baking and the products that are bought in has gone up and up and up. No, the reason they have this rule is because, and also when you have coffee in the morning or tea in the afternoon, you have to talk shop. You have to talk about a problem that you're dealing with and that you don't know how to deal with. Maybe this is common in all of your labs and all of your companies. But the reason for this rule is cross-fertilization, is getting people who are, they're broadly qualified in similar areas, but they're working in radically different areas, is to get them to talk over tea and coffee, and it's amazing how insights and breakthroughs come through. So I saw that coffee was going on and on and on this morning, and no doubt that's because you were cross-fertilizing and you were solving one another's problems. This is me. I'm Sam Knowles. What on earth is this buccaneer telling you about storytelling? I put this picture up partly so you can mentally throw rotten tomatoes at me, partly so that you can locate me. I come from a town in East Sussex, Lewes, East Sussex, in the south of England, just near Brighton, on the meridian. And we take bonfire night very seriously. This isn't me last week. I was dressed up like this. The reason for this beard is that I'm a buccaneer. A little town, a sleepy liberal town of 14,000 people becomes about 100,000 people, where we burn effigies of people who've done something a little bit ahead of themselves during the course of the previous year. You'll have no idea which politicians from the UK were built in effigy this year. I might even show you a picture later. So why am I here to talk to you about this? What credentials do I have to talk about this? I've worked for 30 years, this is my 31st year, mostly in communication, mostly in marketing communication, working with brands big and small, business to business, business consumer. I have a very long affiliation with Unilever, but work with many, many different companies. After about a dozen years in corporate and brand communication, I had what was known at the time as PMT, or pre-millennial tension, and I had to go back to school. I come from a very, very academic family. I had nephews and nieces who were getting doctorates, and I didn't have one. So I had to go back to school just to scratch this academic itch. And originally, my first degree was in classics, Latin and Greek and Sanskrit. And I loved story and story structure and what Aristotle tells us about the 3-part structure. I'll come back to that. The way that we as humans, as creatures, as a species, respond and react to story structure. That was what floated my boat, that lit my fires first time round. You see, I was really badly taught mathematics at school. I was no good at it. I was in a state grammar school. I was in the 5th out of 6 streamed classes for mathematics. And there were more animal noises than algebra taking place in my mathematics classes, let me tell you. Maybe familiar to some of you. So, experiencing this angst of working for many, many different brands towards the end of the last millennium, I decided to go back to school. And I decided to study experimental psychology. And I gave up a big 6-figure job with a prestigious West End London PR agency to go back to school, moved to Sussex, went to the University of Sussex, now the home of the biggest psychology school in the UK. And the first 2 hours of my new life was a statistics lecture. Now my jaw hit the floor. You know, I'd been badly taught. I was no good at any kind of mathematics. But fortunately, it didn't take me too long with two very good statistics teachers, who indeed a few years later became colleagues when I lectured and taught on statistics myself. They explained to me, as you all know very well, that statistics is just another language. I'd had Latin and Greek and Sanskrit, and I now had multivariate analysis of variance and t-tests and chi-squareds. I was able to generate data and to capture data and then to tell stories with data. And it was exciting. And when I went back into consultancy, which I did about 4 or 5 years later, there was a lot of data in the communications industry. And I can say this having worked in PR and communications for 30 years. It's an industry and a profession filled with rank amateurs. I am one of those rank amateurs. And they're very scared of numbers and they're very scared of data. So when data from Twitter and Facebook and all sorts of other sources came out, they just said, give it to Sam, he'll deal with it, he'll be fine. He knows how to deal with numbers. And it seemed to be quite interesting. You know, I had this roller coaster, mishmash career of 3 degrees, 2 in psychology, 1 in classics. But it became clearer and clearer to me that actually data and story were not divorced. They were actually just 2 parts of the same way of looking at the world. And so I branded myself a data storyteller. That's what I do. I work with companies big and small, business to business, to consumer. The more technical, the better. I'm in love with R&D because that's where the interest and the innovation and the insight and the progress really lies. I think as you maybe many of you would agree. And so I created a small, there are 3 of us, consultancy called Insight Agents, and we are data storytellers. My business partner works with academics to help them to find and express and tell the stories of the real world impact of their work, and I work with companies. She does the more serious stuff, I do the more frivolous stuff. And let me tell you, I mean, I'm sure you know this, there is literally nothing more boring than somebody who's written a book, because do they talk about it? Oh, they do talk about it. I have actually written a book called Narrative by Numbers. I can even see a copy on Fabienne's desk over there. Narrative by Numbers, How to Tell Powerful and Purposeful Stories with Data, that brings together the fruits of my experience and gives 6 golden rules for better data storytelling. Now, you don't have to buy this book. It's not contingent on your being here that you buy this book. There may even be a copy given out to the best data storyteller after our exercises later today. Who knows how exciting that would be. You don't have to buy it. There are plenty of jokes in it, which I won't be doing all of today, but you don't have to buy it because I'm going to tell you what is really the essentials of it, the 6 golden rules. And even though I could lecture you on Maneuver and confidence intervals, you don't need that. But actually, fundamentally, this is a story about empathy, about human understanding, about knowing your audience, about talking in that rarest of human dialects, business and corporate and academic dialects, that avoids the curse of knowledge, we'll come back to that, and speaks in a uniquely human way. So I think that data storytelling is fundamentally an act of empathy. Empathy and understanding for those you're looking to persuade. Judicious use of numbers. So enough of the buccaneer, enough of the book. Look, there's my doctorate, there's my bookshelf, one of my bookshelves at home. The effects of alcohol on memory for emotionally significant events. I paid students to get drunk and look at dodgy pictures for 3 years. What a great time that was. Just nestling in front of 1 or 2 copies of the book there. So yes, the effects of alcohol on emotionally significant events. So I worked in a human psychopharmacology lab. That was me. Now I'm just going to show you a very short video, and in this short video I'll make my case for data storytelling, and you'll realize that in my business we pay very little for voiceover artists. I'm hoping you will. Pregnant pause. We may skip over this. We've skipped over it. I can give you a private showing of that later. Professor David Spiegelholter. Professor David Spiegelholter runs something called the Winton Centre at Cambridge. I don't know if you've come across David Spiegelholter. Professor Sir David Spiegelholter. He's the mathematician in a lab full of psychologists, experimental psychologists. He published this book, The Art of Statistics Learning from Data, earlier this year. And he could think of no better way to talk about data storytelling, my phrase, not his, than basically copying what Nate Silver had said at the beginning of The Signal and the Noise. You may know Nate Silver. Nate Silver is he runs the 538 blog, which is now owned by ESPN, used to be affiliated with the New York Times. He's the guy who predicted 49 out of 50 congressional districts in the first Obama election, 50 out of 50 correctly in the 2012 Obama election, and 0 out of 50 in the 2016 Trump election. But he was the least wrong, okay? He was the least wrong. But what Silver says, and what Spiegelholter quotes him saying, is, and you've read it all yourself and digested it and agreed, or maybe have a different point of view, that the numbers have no way of speaking for themselves, that we actually are those who speak for them. We imbue them with meaning. And that's, I think, a very important responsibility when we're at the coalface of data, when we find interesting things out, that it's us that speaks for them. They really do not speak. Particularly in a business environment where there is more and more data, but data is relevant all over. But where there is so much data, the temptation for any individual who's got some data and is excited with it is just to present it and say, look at what we should do now. And there's really no understanding just from raw data. Casual observations based on data, not helpful. So how do we use what is inherent in data and then use that to create powerful insights that move people to action? Because it's all about moving people to action. So 3 things I want to talk about. 1, the challenge that we face, all of us face, as storytellers. You might revile, you might not like being called storytellers, but we're all storytellers, and we face a challenge, a lot of challenges in a bigger and bigger data world. I want to talk a little bit about why narrative by numbers, why bring these 2 things together, not just my personal journey, but why it's important to bring these 2 things together, and then to give you these 6 golden rules. And hopefully that will, I'm sure you're all brilliant data storytellers. I don't believe Lee's when she says that, there's a crying need for this. I'm sure you're great data storytellers, but primed with this, let's see what you do with the exercises this afternoon. We'll come to those this afternoon. One's with a data set or a group of data that you won't have seen. 3 others are maybe more familiar to you. So that's what I want to do today. So the challenge that we face as storytellers. So story and story structure is something that we inherently as human beings will react to. There's up top left we have what is known in British schools, British preschools, as circle time. Story, we look to navigate the world through stories of heroes and villains. I mentioned I was a classicist originally. The Latin word for fireplace is focus. And when we sit around a campfire, I'm sure many of us will have done this. Think of the stories that tumble out as we all focus our attention. I have no doubt that in 2,000 years' time, the word for focus will be smartphone, and we'll be maybe slightly dumber for that. Office gossip. Is there any office gossip in any of your organizations? I'm sure there isn't. But office gossip, what a social lubricant. Have you seen who's walked out with who and gone early to that meeting in Budapest? Office gossip, very useful. All of the box sets, all of the streaming box sets that mark so many of our lives. Story structure. We don't necessarily want to be Tony Soprano in the waste management business in New Jersey, but we can somehow navigate the world by the little trials and tribulations that even a mafia boss will face. And this final picture here, the guy in the blue jalaba on the far left with the blue and white hat, this is the Jam El Fnar in Marrakesh. And every night at 7 o'clock, he comes back to tell another episode in his epic story, and people gather round in their hundreds to hear. So story and story structure is the way that we navigate the world. And it's the way that your audiences, when you're presenting in your labs, to your companies, at conferences, here today, no pressure on those who are presenting during the course of this conference, it's the way that we navigate. We want a beginning, a middle, and end. We don't want it to be, it was good, it stayed good, and it turned out all right. There need to be changes. We need to respond to the story and the story structure. John le Carré, the great British spy writer, just written a fascinating novel all about the B word, as we're allowed to say in the UK, Brexit. He said, the cat sat on the mat is not a story, the cat sat on the dog's mat. Now that is a story, and that's a story that happened in my very house only 2 nights ago, let me tell you. It was definitely a story. Tony, named after Soprano the cat, now has a dog tooth-shaped emblem on his ear. So story is important. Another classical illusion, you know the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. When Theseus went to slay the Minotaur, his girlfriend Ariadne, who he went on to treat very badly, but that's another story, his girlfriend Ariadne gave him a ball of golden thread so he could find his way out of the labyrinth, having killed the Minotaur. My doctoral supervisor, psychopharmacologist called Dora Duca, always talked about the importance of the golden thread that weaves its way through my experiments and what I was looking to demonstrate about binge drinking. The golden thread. It's not that we need to tell the same story again and again, but we need to tell a coherent and satisfying story. There's an HBO series called Succession, which is about a sort of Rupert Murdoch type figure. I don't know if any of you have been watching this. It's a great series. This guy here, in the middle is the father. These are his children and nephew and son-in-law. And it's a story. I mean, it says here, this is a review from I think from the New York Times. Succession may be only about the privileged few, and boy are they privileged if you see their yacht. Many of whom behave appallingly. I think every single one of them around that table behaves appallingly in a way that none of us would. But it's also funny, and it's a well-observed family saga that gives it a wider, timeless appeal. So story is really important. Okay, that's my message there. Last thing on story, Aristotle. I mentioned classicists. Aristotle wrote a very small, very readable, particularly in translation, book called The Poetics. And Aristotle was looking at the structure of story in the 3 forms of entertainment that there were at the time. No box sets, no novels, just tragedy, comedy, and epic poetry. And Aristotle talked about the 3-act structure. And this is the 3-act structure that underpins all good Hollywood films, all good books that you read. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, set up, confrontation, resolution. You have a turning point in your story. In movie terms, that's called the inciting incident. And then the climax, when things are resolved. You can think of it, you know, just in narrative terms, as the past, the present, and the future. This is what's happened with sensory science in the area of cheese historically. This is what's happening now, and this is where we're going in the future. You can think of it as a really useful template. A research overview, current thinking, opportunities. So follow Aristotle. I think that's probably the last classical reference you may be relieved to hear. Austin, Texas-based artist called Austin Cleon. Really interesting little book called Show Your Work. He's got how important it is during your stories for something to happen, for there to be a change in fortune. So he has Cinderella, which starts out okay, things get really bad, but Prince Charming ends ends well. Sorry, no, this is Cinderella here. This is Man in Hole. You may know the story Man in Hole. Man falls down hole, gets out of hole. So starts okay, falls down hole, gets out. This is Kafka's Metamorphosis. It just falls off the charts of bad fortune. But things need to change. You can't write a story that says we were a brilliant research lab, we discovered some fantastic things, and we continued big. Not interesting. It doesn't work for story and story structure. Dan Pink, the American business writer, in his book To Sell is Human, says that we are all in the moving business, the persuading business. Now, whether we're a teacher who wants her pupils to do homework and revise for exams, whether we're a doctor who needs his patient to take a course of drugs to the end, whether we're a research scientist who wants to put in a bid for more funding, get the green light for that product innovation from marketing, whoever we are, we're in the moving and the persuading business. But just throwing data at people, just giving people information, trying to overwhelm them with the force of our very considerable intellect in this room is not going to work. You may have heard there was a referendum in the UK about 3 years ago, and the Remain side of the EU referendum, they were labelled by their opponents Project Fear because they lined up national and international experts to give data point after data point after data point about how things were going to be awful after Brexit. Not making a political point at all. But I read in a cognitive psychology paper the other day that there is something called the Project Fear phenomenon, which is scattergun approach to lots of information. Cognitive Psychology 101 tells us that if we're entrenched in a position, if we hold a strong position and people throw arguments at us and they want to try and persuade us, we just close up and become more entrenched in that position. So bear that in mind when you're building your next research debrief and presentation. Now there's a however, or rather there are 4 howevers, that the increasing volumes of data in our world throw to us. There's too much noise. As a consequence, we suffer from what is known as continuous partial attention. And then we live in this fake news post-truth world. Does data even matter when the Oxford English Dictionary makes fake news its word of the year in 2016 and post-truth is the Collins word of the year in 2017? They seem to be awarding phrase of the year, but that's another point. And then there's content curation. So if you live in a world of commercial communication and you are developing scientific advances that make food and drink products more delicious, more filling, whatever it might be, well, we live in a world where people can curate that content away, from commercial radio through Spotify and Apple Music, from TV through subscriber video on demand services like Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, Netflix, obviously. So some 4 things. I mean, this is just a horrible slide of too many social logos, social media platform logos. But how many ways are there to communicate for the companies and the brands and the organizations that you work for? How many ways are there to communicate? I wish this phrase were mine, from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg. This book, Big Data here, says that between the invention of the printing press in 1485 to the end of 2013, we had created enough data to fill iPads, big fat capacity iPads, that would stretch to the moon. And by the end of 2014, it was the same again. There's a lot of data out there. How do we find and use only relevant data? I'll come back to that. This is one of my clients. Only last week, things didn't end terribly well for him. Maurice Saatchi, the founder of the advertising agency Saatchi & Saatchi, at Cannes Festival of Media nearly 15 years ago said, how can a teenager in the 30 seconds of a TV commercial take a call, send a text, receive a photo, play a game, download a track, read a magazine, and watch commercials at 6 times speed? It was 2006. I know we've speeded up since then, but all of those things are possible. They call it continuous partial attention. Now, think of the people that you're looking to influence with your research debrief, with your plan for innovation. How much time are they actually going to give to the presentation that you make to them, to the report that you sweat all night for, when they've got all of these other competing demands, partly from other data sources, but partly because of the very busyness of business? So beware of continuous partial attention. It's a picture from the High Street of Lewes, East Sussex. What a surprise to see a couple of leading Conservative politicians. Actually, there were 6 Borises made and burnt that night, let me tell you. In a spirit of, change, perhaps. So we live in this post-truth world, books about post-truth, post-truth America. We live in this post-truth world, in this world in which data and the validity of data is routinely questioned. Politicians around the world are just, if they don't like a question, they're just saying fake news. Politicians are setting the tone for public debate and public dialogue. So does that matter? Does any of the data that you've collected in the last 2 or 3 years matter? I contend, don't worry, I'm not here to undermine you. I contend that it has never mattered more, but it's how you present that data and the way that you think in an empathetic way of those you're seeking to influence that really matters. And then finally, this thing about content curation. So as I say, if you're working in a commercial organization, it's getting increasingly possible to filter out commercial messaging. Ad blockers, the use of ad blockers is rising and rising and rising. Apple Safari now has built into it, because of the battle between Apple and Facebook, Apple Safari blocks any kind of Facebook tracking. So it's possible to curate this, both the big platforms but also individually, to curate away commercial communication. So those are my big 4 howevers, the big difficulties that maybe we face in a bigger data world. But don't despair. Okay, so why, second point here, why narrative by numbers? Why is it important and why is it possible to bring these 2 things together, and why have they been pushed apart historically? So I think the first is a problem with education. There are 2 problems. And that problem with education is that for too long, in too many cultures, there has been an arts-science divide. And I know that there are brilliant things like the International Baccalaureate that will encourage a much rounder education. But we specialise. We specialise 16, we specialise at 18, we get narrower at 21. So the further we go, I mean, I well remember in my human psychopharmacology lab that even in a research group when everybody was working on alcohol, 5 PhDs, one lead supervisor, another supervisor. Actually, a lot of us I didn't know anything about implicit memory and eyewitness testimony that one of my colleagues was doing. And she'd talk about it and it was very interesting, but I knew very little about it. So the further we go, and you've all gone clearly a very long way, the more specialized we become. But I think that's a mistake because we're not just artists and scientists. The two fundamental, I think, skills that there are lots of skills that we create, but for the point of view of this argument, the two fundamental skills that we possess as creatures in our navigation of the storytelling world are the ability to look at data and the ability to make sense of it, and then to use that as the foundation stones of our storytelling. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the problem with psychology or popular psychology. If you Google left brain, right brain, you get some fantastic images. This isn't the best one. I don't know why I use this one, but the best one, I think, has got a pencil-drawn left brain with DNA helix and equations, and I could almost translate the equations from the Greek. The grey, dull, grinding, scientific, mathematical, and then on the right-hand side there's this beautiful explosion of colour and flowers and music and tragedy and comedy masks. It's quite clear that there is hemispheric localization of different brain functions. I mean, we don't understand a lot about how the mind works, but we're understanding more and more about the plumbing and the wiring. We're not terribly good at understanding, if there are 110-ish, 120 different neurotransmitters, and they maybe 15 of them are released at the same time, and they're interacting on one another. Think of the last 4 or 5-way interaction that you were reporting on in one of your papers, or you read about how hard it is to understand a 4 or 5-way interaction. Well, if there are 120, we don't even... Steve Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, says that we lack the cognitive architecture to understand how our brains actually work. He may be being pessimistic. But I think there is a problem with psychology, not those who've talked about hemispheric lateralization particularly, but the way that the popular media and the way that some politicians and the way that public figures have said, well, he's a left brain person, she's a right brain person. We need to, I work with a consultancy that says, we are the left brain advisor to the CMO. Well, good luck with that. What about the right brain that brings integration and actually makes sense of the words that the left brain is able to understand? So left brain, right brain being by necessity forced, I guess, into different paths in education. Those are two big problems. Whereas the two skills that we all need, I contend, in the modern knowledge economy are the ability to look at and make sense of data, and then the ability to use that as the underpinning, but not the starting point, the underpinning of the stories that we tell. Two reasons why this matters. One, the bigness of data. So much information, moon and back and back and back. And then, of course, the fact that many more voices matter. In the corporate and brand world, in the academic world, many more voices matter. There's not just a single point of communication. If any of you happens to send a tweet today or writes a blog, my view of the organization that you work for may well be changed, and changed permanently because it leaves a permanent trace. It may well be changed because of what you write. Even if your Twitter bio said the views are all my own, or my cat's got control of my phone, I can find that you work for that company, and then my view might change. So that's why it matters. Now, the reductionist in me says that there is a fundamental equation of impact in the modern knowledge economy, and it's that analytics plus storytelling equals influence. That's a reductionist in me. And I'm going to show you now half a dozen golden rules about how to make analytics and storytelling really come together. Any questions so far? Okay. 6 golden rules. None of these, I hasten to add, will be a surprise. None of them will be earth-shattering. I'm sorry to disappoint already. But taken together, if you apply these to the papers that you write, if you apply these to the grant applications that you complete, if you apply these to the presentations that you're building, I'll argue that you'll get a better response. Now, the purpose of communication, you know, Dan Pink's line, we're all in the moving, persuading business. It may well be that some people really don't like your story, but much better to get a response than to get a meh. So much better to get that. Okay, number one, keep it simple. Gosh, he came in all the way from UK to tell us to keep it simple. Are we going to get better than this? I argue that this is a really important one. Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde, and Winston Churchill are all said to have said, I would have written you a shorter letter, I just didn't have the time. I think they may have been quoting each other. But keeping it simple is really difficult. So I'm encouraging you to use a few straightforward numbers. I'm encouraging you not to be inaccurate for the sake of it. I run a lot of training around data storytelling. And as an icebreaker at the beginning of that session, I ask people to tell me the one number that best defines them as an individual. It's a silly game. But it gets people to think, and it gets people to talk, and it gives me time to learn and remember their names, which is of great benefit. And I was training a software company, a game software company called Square Enix. Any gamers amongst you may know Final Fantasy is their big game. Japanese, Danish, UK, Californian. Their entire, it's about this number of people. And one of the Danish guys said, my number is 76.1467. And I said, that's remarkably precise. He said, it was my grade point average in my final degree, and it defines me as an individual. And I said, no disrespect, you could have rounded it up. I would have given you that extra mark, and we'd have known that you were a first-class student. No, he insisted that that was that. So I'm not encouraging you to be inaccurate for the sake of being inaccurate, but I'm really encouraging you not to show your workings out at the very first opportunity. I call myself a data storyteller. It is possible. There are algorithms. I subscribe to a couple online, one particular called readable.io, where you can take your text and you can run it through a linguistic analytics engine, and it will tell you how many years of continuous education you would need to have passed through to understand it at first reading. It's called Flesch-Kincaid, the Flesch-Kincaid score, if you've come across it. And you're aiming for 10, 8, 9, 10. You're aiming for end of primary school, beginning of secondary school, because that's the average population's reading level. The BuzzFeed, by the way, it also gives you a score between 0 and 100. So BuzzFeed is 90. The New York Times is 65. The Economist is 43. Apple iTunes Terms and Conditions is 20. The average insurance document, small print, is minus 20, and Marcel Proust comes in at minus 146. But, you know, streams of consciousness. It's based on two variables. It's not based on the words that you write. It's based on the number of words per sentence and the number of syllables per word. It's really simple. But I'd encourage you, if you're writing something data-rich, you know, maybe think about using something like that to look at the language that you're using, because I saw a study the other day that said in the workforce in Europe, across Europe, 17% of the workforce in Europe are data literate. The office-based workforce are data literate. Not very many. And if you're telling a complex story which has got numbers at the heart of it, if your language is complex, if you've got 50, 60 syllable or indeed word sentences, you're making it really hard to understand. And if it's hard to understand, people will go on their phones, people will zone out, they'll think about planning their holiday in their mind. Particularly avoid exposition and backstory. So exposition is what Hollywood scriptwriters mean, but is their word for backstory. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen any of the Star Wars films, but I'm going to give you a spoiler for episodes 4 and 5, the first and the second films from the late 70s. So if you don't want to know what happens, if you don't want to know whose father Darth Vader is, then you're going to have to turn your ears away now. But how much better is it that at the end of the 5th episode, when Darth Vader cuts off Luke Skywalker's hand, and he says, "But Luke, I am your father," how much better is that than allowing George Lucas to make episodes 1, 2 and 3 that are all about a trade war between America and China. No, much better that we have that non-exposition. But think about your own work, think about your own reports. How much backstory do you give? What you want is to stimulate people to say, that's really interesting. I don't agree with that. Can you tell me more? I had a client once, a very irascible Frenchman. He ran household cleaning for Unilever. He ran Domestos and Cif and bathroom and household cleaning. And I had a meeting with him. I was meeting him for the first time in Milan. And Unilever's office in Milan then was unair conditioned. And it was a very muggy day, very hot day in Milan. I arrived late, and I've been warned, this man doesn't suffer fools gladly. Who does, but he really doesn't. And I opened my laptop. I said, sorry, I'm late. Hello, nice to see you. Yes, what are we going to do? And he was drumming his fingers on the desk, rubbing the back of his head where he'd rubbed a bald patch with his irritation. And he looked at my laptop, and he saw it said slides 1 to 32. And he grabbed my laptop, which felt quite intrusive, and then he highlighted slides 21 to 32, hit delete, hit save to desktop, and said, right, present it to me now. I don't do more than 20 slides. And I said, lovely to meet you, Jean-Laurent, how lovely to see you. I closed the laptop, because that was the only version of the presentation I had, and said, shall we have a conversation? Much better, he said. So think about the spirit of this man when you're putting together your presentation. The great thing is that you can have an appendix. I have to tell you, I work with the market research industry. I was with the excellent corporate reputation division of Ipsos Mori, big research business. And I tried to persuade them to put slides 21 to 162 in an appendix. It was hard work, but they're beginning to get there. So avoid exposition and backstory. Here are two men. This man on the left, Jose Mourinho, doesn't have a job currently, a football management job. This man on the right, Marcus Rashford, played very well for England during the World Cup in Russia last year. And just before Mourinho was sacked, he was asked, Jose, why don't you play Marcus Rashford more often? And rather than saying, which he could easily have said, in the last 2 seasons, I've played him in half of the matches for about 1/2 each. Rather than saying that, he said, well, I've played him for 2,062 minutes. If you divide that by 38 games in a season, it's 34.2%. It was really, what it led to was journalistic fuel to the fire. As a data storyteller, he was a calamity. The following week, he was fired. You might think he was fired because his team lost 3-1 at their big rivals, Liverpool, but actually, no, it was because he was a bad data storyteller. And dear old Marcus is just saying, more is not necessarily more, gaffer. That's what players call their managers in England. So think about exposition, backstory, think about keeping it really simple. Number 2, finding and using relevant data. Now, you might think, well, this is another statement of the obvious, and sometimes insights are statements of the obvious. I show you this word cloud here, partly because I have a friend who's written a book on social media analytics who describes the word cloud as the mullet of social media analytics. You know, long at the front, short at the sides, long at the back, David Hasselhoff haircut. I like that because in the 80s, I myself had a mullet. And like my friend Chuck, who's written this book, it was a cool idea back in the 80s, but word clouds don't tell you anything more than frequency. Partly for that, but mostly just to show the different types of data that surround businesses, organizations, academic institutions are enormous. The work that you do yourselves, clearly adding to that amount of data. Employee data is really important. What do your employees think about your organization, about how innovative it is? But what are they saying on Glassdoor? What are they really saying when the bosses aren't looking? Huge amounts of data. What's your share of voice? What's your share of voice in earned media, in social and news media? But then the huge number of publicly available data sources that there are. Huge number of publicly available data sources. The CIA World Factbook, if I ever want to know how many people have mobiles and landlines in 209 different countries, that would be my go-to place. The current president of the United States doesn't trust the CIA, probably doesn't trust their fact book, but it's a very good resource. There's so much out there. And of course, we all know when you get lots of data sources and you try and triangulate with your own consumer attitude research, with demographic trends or with affordability indices or with GDP, when you put lots of data sources together, Well, bad things can happen because when you correlate a lot of things together, you can get results. You put lots of data sets together, particularly time series data sets together, you get a lot of often spurious results, and I'll come back to that. But my urge to you is to follow the principles. I don't know if you know this guy. This is Simon Sinek, Mr. Start With Why, the third most watched TED Talk of all time. And he's talking a lot about purpose and corporate and brand purpose. This is a TED Talk from 2011 at TEDx in Puget Sound. And he talks about how companies that start with their why, with their purpose, with why they do what they do, not make money, that's a byproduct. Those that start with their why, that know and understand why they are in business, they are the ones that really are excelling. And there's a lot of evidence now that shows that purpose-led organizations in whatever sector are those that are more successful. I encourage you to channel, well, 1, to watch that if you haven't, 2, to watch it again if you have, because it's a good watch, but 3, to channel his start with why. Start with why you are looking at this particular data set. You've run this test on satiety, absolutely. Are there other data sets that you could bring into that would help to explain that, past experiments? What might it be? Start with why. You're good scientists, so you'll never go out like many marketeers and try and prove a hypothesis. You'll test a hypothesis. But start with why. And ask the right questions of your data. Now, I'm really hoping that this plays. Come on, play. Because this is a brilliant example of finding and using relevant data in a public education film. It's not going to play. My films are not working today. Never mind. But we can show them at lunchtime. What it showed was a bunch of hard men in a disused warehouse with a guy who'd just had a heart attack, bringing him back to life through cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And these hard men were doing it to the backing track of the Bee Gees' Staying Alive. What an amazing, fantastic, more than coincidence, which is 110 to 120 beats per minute, which is exactly the pulse that you need to beat up and down on the chest. And amazing, this great juxtaposition of hard men and the Bee Gees and all of the rest of it. Sad it didn't show. And it also said, and we live in this strange country, I live in this strange country, the UK, where we can't decide between metric and imperial system. I'm sure the current Prime Minister, actually we don't have a Prime Minister, but the previous Prime Minister will take us back to imperial any day now. But he says you have to push down 5 or 6 centimetres, that's about 2.5 inches in old money. He's appealing to a very broad section of the population. He's conveying with some very, very relevant data points what you need to know. And he says at one point, better a cracked rib than he kicks the bucket. Better that you crack I'd never been on a course. I didn't know that if you want to get a heart starting again, you've got to crack a rib. And that's how far you've got to push down. But the absolute beauty of that ad is 110 to 120 beats per minute. That is what I would call an absolute killer statistic. Excuse the pun. Find and use relevant data. Third is false positives, avoiding false positives. There is, have a sip of water, excuse me. There is a Harvard Law student called Tyler Vegan. Tyler Vegan, his parents were really proud of him when he started Harvard Law 11 years ago. He hasn't graduated yet. Tyler has become obsessed through the open data movement with publicly available data sets. And I challenge any of you in this room to get off spuriouscorrelations.com, if you don't know it already, in less than half an hour. There's 30,000 spurious correlations. They're all time series data. Films, number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. When I saw a bus go by in London with a Nicolas Cage movie last week, and I saw there was a pool here, I didn't pack my trunks, obviously, right? The number of people who die by becoming entangled, this is a sensory one, people who die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets and per capita cheese consumption. The correlation coefficient there is 0.95. It's not bad, right? You'd be quite pleased with that in one of your experiments, because clearly when people have cheese before they go to bed, they have bad dreams, right? We all know that. And they die as a result. And they're not all about dairy, by the way. The divorce rate in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine. In about 2000, the caregivers of Maine realized that they were more likely to stay married if they served butter rather than margarine. Now, I really don't need to tell you this, okay? I don't need to tell you this. However, I want to tell you a story briefly about ice cream sandwiches. Ben & Jerry's has been in the UK since the mid-90s, owned by Unilever since 2000. Twice it had tried to launch ice cream sandwiches because think about Brits, right? We should like ice cream sandwiches. We like biscuits, we like chocolate, and we like ice cream. Put them together, it's a winning combination. And if you've ever had a Ben & Jerry's Son of a Witch, great brand, if you ever had one, you'll know that it's a really good combination. Now, it had failed twice. Once it was a really bad summer, once their distribution system didn't quite work. But in 2013, the marketing director said to her bosses, she said, I want to try ice cream sandwiches again. And they said, go ahead. Can I have some budget? Well, not much. Can I have a marketing manager? Okay, so hired a marketing manager. And the marketing manager said, can I have a budget? Well, we're not going to go on TV, but you can have a social media budget. Great, it says. This is a natural thing for social media. I'm absolutely convinced. And at the end of July, beginning of August 2013, the young brand manager bounces into his boss's office and he says to her, 8 o'clock in the morning, Blackfriars House in Unilever in London, and says, boss, let me show you this. And he brought out his chart. And his chart showed that between February and August, when the social media company had been in place, look at what green is Instagram. Great, Instagram. And then yellow is sales. They're mapping very closely. And then, do you remember that there was that late night TV show on BBC where the presenter ate one of them on camera in 30 seconds? And he broke the BBC's charter on commercial messaging by holding up the box. Look at that surge we got in Twitter. Isn't it fantastic? Can I have some more money, please, for my social media agency? To which his boss said no. Immediately, and he was really crestfallen. She pushed herself out from behind her desk and she came round. She said, what else has happened during this period? And he said, well, I don't know, it's going to move from February to March. She said, she got out her highlighter pen now because she really wanted to get on with the next meeting and said, look, it got warmer. I feel that might be the hidden third cause in this equation. I'm just encouraging you to, when you're using and blending lots of different data sources, to avoid the trap that dear old Tyler Vegan and spurious correlations has fallen into. Right. Spiegelholter again. So, a quote from him. This is his rather than Nate Silver's. Even in an era of open data, data science and data journalism, the era we live in, we still need basic statistical principles in order not to be misled by apparent patterns in numbers. So, what does that outlier mean? Is that outlier easily ignorable? Why should we ignore it? What story could it tell? Could that be a whole new market that we don't know about? I'm not here to talk to you at all about your statistical validity, but think in your storytelling what that can do. Right, the curse of knowledge. The Central Subcommittee Steering Group for the Facilitation of Brevity and Clarity Usage in the User-Provider Communication Interface, or formerly this group was known as the Plain English Group. Eve, when she ate her apple, could not unknow what she knew. Dear old Adam took a bit longer to catch on. The curse of knowledge. Obligatory picture of POTUS 45 for you. I show you this because I'm going to demonstrate the curse of knowledge to you. Now, I've got a tune playing in my head. I'm just going to clap, that's why he's there. I've got a tune playing in my head, and I can hear it. I can hear, give you a clue, there's a guitar and bass and drums and a vocalist. Do you know what tune I can hear? Hey Jude. By the Beatles. Obviously, I knew that, and you didn't. Now, there's one exception to this tune. So I had the curse of knowledge. I could hear McCartney and Lennon. There's one exception, which I think is proof categorical that one tune in the world is hardwired into us, and it goes like this. Happy birthday to you. That's the only one. So the curse of knowledge. Steve Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, written lots of books about language, more recently written books about society and anger and war and poverty, but this book, The Sense of Style, is really a book about how to write better, and he talks a lot about the curse of knowledge. And the people who he says are most guilty of the curse of knowledge are lawyers, financial advisors, scientists, and academics. Those are the ones he really points the finger at. That it is impossible not to know what you know. And that can really affect the way that you build your stories, because surely everyone knows that this is mediated by this and that. No, they don't, and particularly people who haven't got a lot of time. So beware the curse of knowledge, and just avoid showing your workings out. Keep that under the fold. Okay, we're nearly there. It's just me between you and lunch now. Know your audience, so know and understand your audience. Be empathetic. Put yourself into the mindset of those who you're looking to influence. I know that my next video won't play if the first two haven't. My next video was going to be from a campaign from Sport England, a government-funded organisation called This Girl Can. Now, this campaign has led to a sustainable increase in girls aged 14 to women aged 70 taking up and regularly participating in exercise and sport. And they've done that by understanding fundamentally what the barriers were to women getting involved in sport. And that shaped the campaign that they ran. Now, there was a delicious 85% in their research that allowed them to really know and understand their audience. They asked women who didn't take exercise, why don't you take exercise? And they found that 85% of them said it was because for fear of being judged by others. Okay, that's an interesting drag on not doing sport and exercise. And then they said, but do people really judge other people who are taking exercise? And they discovered that almost everybody ignores other people taking exercise. You may be, I know this as an early morning, very slow runner. Nobody notices you, nobody sees you. But actually they found of those people who did judge, and there was a small group of people who did judge, a delicious 85% of them judged entirely positively. So rather than thinking, oh, her makeup's running, his hair's out of place, they're wearing hideous lycra, what they think is, that's impressive, I'd like to do that, that's inspiring. Which is why this campaign run by Sport England, This Girl Can, uses real women really exercising, really to make their message. It's like, slight pause, whilst the video doesn't play. Come on. There we go. So Unilever's campaign for real beauty. Again, so Unilever, at the heart of the beauty industry, realized through some cross-cultural research in 20 markets, and so its decision to use real women, its real types, not stereotypes, just 4%. Actually, that's the figure today. When they started, it was just 2% of women would, in all of these different markets, Brazil, Russia, India, France, would use the word beautiful to describe themselves. And so that gave Unilever the legitimacy, they believed, to take on the beauty industry from within and to run the campaign for real beauty. It's now doubled to 4% who would naturalistically use the word to describe themselves. So a measure of success, a long way to go. But I think both of those examples, the Sport England and the Dove campaign for real beauty, show a real empathetic human understanding of the audience that they're trying to influence. Finally, talk human. How many of the papers that you've written recently really sound like people talking? I don't know, probably all of them, every single last one of them. I know it's not always the case. Using emotion, using the range of emotions. Daniel Kahneman, the cognitive psychologist, author of Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about System 1, System 2 thinking. There's quite a consensus that we make our decisions emotionally using the evolutionarily ancient limbic structures in the brain, and we justify them rationally using the grey and white matter that's uniquely ours. Make our decisions emotionally, justify them rationally. Here's a campaign from Spotify, a bit of data storytelling. Dear 3,749 people who streamed It's the End of the World as We Know It on the day of the Brexit vote, hang in there. Now, if you subscribe to Spotify, you will know every year they send you an email that tells you what you've listened to, what type of person you are, what else you might like to listen to. Apparently, I quite like dad rock, but I'm sure that's because my son's learning the guitar, right? He's using my account. They really know what the world is. They really know what the world is listening to. And in any of their communication, they use data and data points, sometimes quite accurately, but they use data in a very human and empathetic way. They talk human. Interestingly, last reference to Brexit, promised, last bus. By the way, did it make international news during the Conservative Party election campaign that Boris Johnson liked making buses out of cardboard boxes? Did that make news? He liked making buses, and it was the most wooden and artificial interview that there was. And the reason that fictitious story was created was so that when you do a Google search, the bus that has 350 million a week to the NHS doesn't come up on the first page. Anyway, that's a footnote. New Scientist, excellent organ New Scientist, said in its editorial not a week after the EU referendum that for reason to triumph, scientists need to learn to engage with emotion. Now you have an amazing area in which you work, because the satisfaction of hunger and thirst, the alteration of mood that can come about, as I'm not trying to get you to put overclaims about the products that you're developing or the sensory changes that can come about as a result of innovation. But you work in an amazing area, and so you're naturally dealing with emotion already. So this may well be not so relevant to you, but learn to engage with emotion. Think about how it is that we make our decisions emotionally and justify them rationally. Okay, so finally, just in summary, keep it simple yet smart. Find and use only the most relevant data that you can, avoiding these false positives. This curse of knowledge is important. Beware that curse of knowledge. Know your audience, understand your audience. I hope I've done that. I hope there haven't been too many numbers today with you. And then talk in this fundamentally human way. Now, naturally, you have different audiences. You have bosses, you have finance, you have the ESN network. You know your audience. You know that you can use acronyms in a more technical area. But think about, you can't just repurpose that presentation to go and talk to regulators. So know your audience and talk in a human way. Really try and strip out as much jargon as you can. I have to say, I love doing my doctorate. I scratched that academic itch. At the beginning of my viva, my internal and external examiners said two things. They said, one, minor corrections, you're all right. So that was nice. So we had a good discussion. The second thing they said was, between us, we've examined 200 doctoral theses. The external was very senior psychopharmacologist from UCL. She'd done 160. Internal, this was his 40th. And they said, we, between us, have never read a thesis that has less jargon in it. And I was just delighted by that. I was too delighted. I think I answered the first 2 or 3 questions badly because I was basking in this glow of having written something that was fundamentally human. I leave you, before we think about questions and then the exercises and lunch, with a statistic, one of the few statistics I've given you, that after a presentation, a surprisingly precise 63% of attendees will remember stories and 5% will remember statistics. So think about, when you're making a presentation, you want to move people to action, to accept or reject what you're arguing for, to give it mimetic potential. At the water cooler, you want the boss who bumps into someone who's been in that presentation to say, what was Lise talking about? Ah, well, she said we should do this, this, and this because the data shows this. Either fantastic or no, or let's have another meeting. You want that to have, you want your stories to be pass-onable at the water cooler. That's all I have. Any questions?